Morning. When I first started the In Search of Fearlessness project and eventually a research center and community that built around it, this would be in the late 1980s, early 1990s, Calgary, Alberta, Canada. My vision was basically to have these fearlessness resource centers all around the world. Um, you know, at least one in every major city. It'd be great if they were in every small city, every town, every village. And the idea was is that people would always have one place they could go to be around a good theory, a good practice, a set of principles, and as they say, actual real techniques to work with trauma. I say trauma, but that's not the word I used back in 1989 and 90 when I was starting and conceiving of these basic processes for the path of fearlessness. What I used is the language that was very basic and common, and it came from a background of my own study of reevaluation co-counseling from Harvey Jackins, which goes back to the 1940s, and it's another story, but that model of peer-to-peer support was for people who are hurting and how they can heal that hurt. And it was an imperative idea, a very simple idea, that the imperative being it's an evolutionary imperative. When you're hurt, you heal. And that is a life-based, process, right? It's one that builds resilience because being in a hurt, wound up in that tight hurt, unhealed, painful memory, um, in your present and in your future will continue to carry its burden in that sense because it is unhealed. It has not received the healing attention and the processing of discharging that distress, that hurt, trauma in that psychic and somatic body, both body, mind, and even some people say spirit, needs healing because we're not a healing culture. That was my intro today. Welcome. We're going to talk today about my experience of doing trauma work. So I think I'll probably label this video Working Through Trauma. And of course, so much as today is about trauma is just getting into all kinds of common discourses, even in the mainstream, which is great, mental health traditions and professions, etc. All that aside, a lot of that I find useful to some degree, but sometimes you need to hear how somebody actually practices doing trauma work. And this is my today walking through with you what has happened for me in the last 48 hours of how I work with trauma. And as I say, I'm working with hurting. I'm working with a pattern that I would encompass within a fear patterning, um, which is basically a distress patterning that becomes fear-based in its core, and then that's how you perceive the world in a fear-based way, sometimes quite phobic and or paranoid, and depending how far that perceptual lens goes, coming out of those painful, hurtful memories that are unhealed. Well, can you heal all the memories that you've had of hurts in your life? Theoretically, yes, you can. Will you? Probably not. Might you? If we had more support, then it's more likely that we will heal more of those. It basically is the more support you get for this healing process, the more wounds you can heal. You can't do it alone. I'm going to not give a lot of theory on the actual process of how we get hurt as humans and then how that, eventually can heal. That's not the purpose of this video per se. But I want to give you a real, walking with me for the next 48 hours. So it started with, again, a couple of days ago, just really kind of feeling, I was just in a really serious mood for a long time. I've been working really hard on a book, just finishing on fearlessness. And a lot of different distresses in our household, including my daughter, including my wife, including me, including the world, things happening in the world. And sometimes, we're so aware, my partner and I, Barbara, that we just, almost feel inundated by all the information and knowledge coming into us. And of course, computers have, you know, accented and, you know, created quite a vessel, for a lot of distress and trauma, terror even, to come into our lives, into our homes through the screen. Um, Not all good. Um, Way too much for what we're built with as human beings, what we're capable of, as far as I'm concerned. And I'm not the only one that's argued that. So that's why we have to limit our diet of this media that comes through this channel. And especially that most of that knowledge is coming without being mediated by a healing process or even a healing understanding with that transmission of the knowledge of all the negative things, bad things, crises going on in the world, etc. We were talking specifically about, as a couple, we've been together 32 years, and we have always sort of practiced some kind of healing work together, and that's because I insisted on it right from the beginning, because I already had background in how important that was for families, for couples, for communities, for organizations, etc. So we were talking, her and I, about how and where is the coronavirus, COVID-19, and all the mutations thereof. Where's that all going, and what's going to be happening in the world, probably in like even the next 6 months to a year or after. And you start to, we did. I mean, we want to know some of that good information, and not all of it's as good as you might think it is. However, all of that aside, what we both ended up feeling, and me particularly, I seem to really go down into a really deep gut level kind of sickness after our conversation. It wasn't like it was a bad conversation, but I was starting to feel sick in my gut. And I'm glad I'm sensitive enough to feel that and notice I don't feel good, I feel sick, And so I was saying that eventually and expressed that to her. And then we ended up watching a movie on, because we thought we'd kind of relax our minds and watch a documentary movie on, and it ended up being on the anti-vaccine movement that's really grown in the last few years, but started decades ago. People who believe in the vaccines, cause more harm than good. They don't trust the governments and the healthcare systems, pharmaceutical companies, et cetera, and how the whole vaccine rollout ends up coming out into our lives and sometimes rolling over us, and yes, indeed, sometimes causing damage. That aside, watching 45 minutes of that anti-vaccine and a lot of really angry activist people in that movie, and then they were trying to cover both sides of the story in the documentary, which was good. It was sort of balanced, but I was just really, sensitive to all the negative, and then I began to realize, that I have, distressed myself around needles, vaccines. Won't go into that. Maybe it'll come out later in the conversation, but it goes back to my early childhood in a very painful experience. All of that aside, I'm like building up. By the end of that show, I just said to Barbara, I said, I got to get some attention. Can you give me some unconditional attention? So that's kind of our cue. Do you have some free attention? We can ask our partner or whoever our peer support is, our allies, as I like to say, in this path of liberation, this path of fearlessness. And so Barbara was able to say, yeah, I'll give you attention. I'm fine. And so sometimes we time it with a timer so that, gives her a break. She knows that there's an end to it. Giving unconditional attention sometimes for a long period of time is difficult because it can trigger our distresses that we're not getting attention. But she was in a good space and I was not. And so I went down on the floor, kind of wrapped myself with a pillow. And at this time, I'm basically now in charge, right, of this session. We call it a healing session. And she is there to just guide, kind of be a birther, midwife for my distress, to come out and heal and get attention and find out more at the end. Where the purpose is to not only discharge emotional energies, body energies that need to be discharged, that are making me in part of my sickness, because I feel really distressed and probably terrified deep inside by all the conversation and reminders and stimulus. So that's called restimulating, places of feeling insecure, the future, um, COVID, what's going to happen. I'm an older person. I could die in a little while and so like that very quickly. But it's not overtly, I was afraid of death. That's not even the point. I don't actually operate and feel that consciously. But all that material was building up. I'm feeling this. And so she's with me for basically me in charge. I know how to do the healing work. I know some of the techniques, etc., for doing that. And one of them is to just allow myself to curl up, usually in a fetal type position. I often have Barbara just put her hand on my heart lightly, and she's just there. She's not interrupting. She's not going to say anything unless I really ask for it, or if she's got a really strong intuition that maybe something she wants to say, she'll say as an observation. But then again, she would only ask my permission. Again, I'm in charge of my session of where I'm going with this distress. So as it turns out, I didn't take me long, and I just started going through kind of these sick feelings and just being with them, and eventually going, ow, oh, ah, oh, oh, making noise, and the noise wants to come out, and it's just spontaneously, just like a child. I can tell you, when you hurt a child, they are not quiet. When a child gets hurt in their natural nature, right? When you get hurt, heal. It's basic law of the universe to self-regulate the system, to get back your healthy, resilient self after an injury, distress that's been imposed or composed within you and your interaction with the environment, whatever the case may be. So then from those noises, my body starts jerking and sometimes shaking more rapidly. Breathing starts to go through all different kinds of cycling, sometimes really deep and long, and sometimes huffing and puffing really rapidly. And I'm just trusting, this is the tough part for most of us who have not learned healing processes. We find it hard to trust the process. Okay, I'm probably not going to describe more of some of the nuances of that. I want to go into the other half, the next day, which was today for me, that I did that healing work the night before. It was great. Have a bath afterwards, put Epsom salts in, and it will suck out some of the toxins that get released when you do deep healing work like I did. I was able to get into some crying, which for me was really hard because I'd become quite psychically numb. I began to be aware after that session how numb I'd kind of become by handling all these distresses for weeks and months, and COVID, et cetera, for over a year. Anyways, there are ways to do the cleansing afterwards. Had a good sleep that night. So next day I had intuitions in the morning. I said, I think I need to go and release my traumas and bad memories I have from this whole area that we live in here in the city. We moved here 3 years ago in this specific area, or just about 3 years. And it's been good to come back to where my childhood was. I was from 3 to about 19 in this area, a couple of communities here. And I love kind of reminiscing and, when I'm in a good space. But when I'm not in a good space or I'm already distressed, I often find I am in these places, memories, right? Going to an old house or down a street, or I remember riding my bike when I was a teenager, or whatever the case may be, or, oh, there's the place where my mom worked, in the motor hotel as a chambermaid worker, and I picked her up day after day, and she was always distressed, and I'd pick her up. So all of these memories I get triggered with. So this is the bringing together of place, and how place is very deeply connected to the human being. We always are connected to place, whether we know how deeply we're connected or not. We're like rooted. And so places contain the mirror, right? The retriggering of memories. Well, what memories do we remember the most? As I say, when I'm in a good space, I remember some of the positive memory. When I'm not in such a good place or even neutral, or if I'm in a darker space of a lot of distress and depression, whatever, when I go in these places of my childhood memories, teenage years, etc., I get really dark. Even I start remembering places of trauma, and that's meant to be. Places are the gift, right? They're the gift that can hold where a memory occurred. It's the context for the psychic wound, or sometimes the bodily and psychic wound, right? Body mind's usually always involved. So that is really important when you visit places that, you go, oh yeah, I'm going to go back and visit that old place where I grew up or went to school. Well, that's good, but I want you to remember there's going to be good memories and bad memories, if you want to put it in simple language. It's not language I like to use, good or bad, not from a healing paradigm. A healing or fearlessness perspective does not use that kind of moralistic language of good or bad. What it is hurt or not hurt. That's how I distinguish the way we should distinguish, as far as I'm concerned, in a healing model. Then we're not putting moral judgments on it, but we're attuning to, were we hurt there or were we not? Okay, well, that's good. You don't need good or bad. That language, in fact, is very unuseful, I have found over the decades of doing this healing and liberation work. So as I had this idea today, this morning, I went out, got on my bike, and I knew I wanted to do this and go and visit several of the places in the neighborhood. I probably knew there was like a dozen places I wanted to go. And the reason is, as I'm moving and we're moving out of this province, I probably won't even be back to this area ever again. So I feel like I'm leaving my home again. And I think that's bringing up a lot of distress for me as well. I kind of love the home and the prairies. Not that I always love all the people and things that go on here, but I love the geography. I love the land. I love the nature of this place. I really do deeply. As I say, not so much the cultural world, but that aside, the cultural world is still very important, probably more than I often acknowledge in my life. That's what I learned today. So my technique was to go visit these sites and to take um, basically a bag of tobacco. So I want to share why I did that, because tobacco is a sacred plant in the Indigenous traditions, and that particular bag of tobacco was given to me as a gift, and to Barbara, from our friend Four Arrows. And he is, initiated within the Lakota tradition, tribal ceremonies and rituals. He's a sun dancer. He was actually in this area doing sun dancing with the tribal person who runs those events about 2 years ago, and he stayed overnight. But he gave this gift because that's what the Indigenous traditions often around here in North America, anyway, often do with this sacred plant. When you get a gift from the world, you give back a piece of tobacco sprinkled and with a prayer of some kind of gratitude, and or maybe more is in the prayer, and maybe you receive a message as a piece of wisdom for you to take from the place. And that's the idea of the tobacco, you see, because you're always taking it from this bag, from the sacred bag of a gift someone's given, and then I get to give the gift back to the world wherever I take something. So when I went to get the memories from these places, in a way I was taking those memories back. I was taking from the world, from the network of the holistic world, the spiritual world, the physical world, the visible, the invisible. It doesn't matter how you want to think about it. But I think in a holistic way like that, as a field, and it's a field of memory and place, and that's connected to my body and my mind and my own autobiography. So that was a gesture I've never done before, to not just go to the place, and maybe I could have journaled, maybe I could have just, done some things to let go of or forgive or whatever. And I did some of those things today at all of the 12 places. But I did this gesture, and I even made up a word that sounded indigenous to me, but I just liked the sound of it. It just came, and I would just drop the tobacco after I had spent some time thinking about what happened in that place. And of course, you can't think of all the things that happened in those places, like my old home, which I was there for, maybe 6 or 7 years, whatever. You can only think of some, and it's amazing how they will pop up to you when you sit in the place. And sometimes the original house that I lived was still there, or a friend's house, for example, where we played, in the band as 14-year-olds, 15, 16, 17, for 4 years or so. That garage is still there in the back of someone's house, and I could actually go there on my bike and just go through things that happened there. And there was at times some violent and very frightening things that happened to me and happened to people who were there. So the key thing with the tobacco, what I found was, because I was focusing on the place and giving a gift and receiving a gift from the place, if that was to be at least like a message or just an attunement, right? Like an awareness, a greater expansion. So I didn't have just the negative memory, especially, and they tend to stick more. That's a real principle of the healing model. When you're hurt, heal. But when you don't heal, the hurt memory stays much more locked in than positive memories, because positive memories don't really need to be remembered biologically. They're nice, but they don't need to be. When you have an injury or a wound, it needs to get attention to heal. That's why you remember generally the negative, and that's why trauma studies, etc., have just confirmed what is a very simple notion. Of course, your negative memories are going to stay longer and stay for the rest of your life if you don't heal them. And it's not a matter of wanting to forget them, heal them, and forget them. No, no. It's about loosening up, untying the knot of the distress and what went on in your body mind system as a pattern under that duress, distress, violence, abuse, whatever may have happened. Again, that would be a larger conversation about exactly what does it mean to heal. Well, that is complex. At some level, it's also very simple, but just to say, doing this ritual, I gave attention, and I received attention from the memory of the place, right? Even if it's from a piece of architecture or just the geography. Oh yeah, I remember being here, even though that used to be a parkland, now it's a houses. That doesn't matter. In my somatic deep memory, I played there, hours and hours and hours. Things happened there. So I'm remembering, and things are starting to come up. So that's great. And then at some points, with the really more negative experiences of abuse, violence that occurred in several of the places I visited today, I was able to just be with it, let the tobacco go, and then I just said this word, that was just coming to me, that was not an English word. I don't even know if it means, it doesn't matter what it means. It's the symbolic, metaphorical gesturing that replaces. So I was kind of emplacing, replacing, and in some way displacing any poisonous, toxic memory patterns that I felt hooked to from those places, because I had not revisited them to do this conscious attending to them as a care. Oh, I will then move to close this video because it's just a short introduction to this work of working through trauma. What I discovered coming back to me, and just spontaneously in the process of just remembering and going back in, sometimes deeply, sometimes not, but remembering, which is remembering, becoming part of that community of members that were always a context for everything that happened. It's not just a self. I have an environment. I have others around. There's a world. What I realized, and this was really the great insight of today, there was a field of care already there. And everybody that I encountered, I'll just talk about the negative experiences. I was very aware that they were also in a field of care. And sometimes that field of care failed. And that's why people who are hurt pass on hurts to others, because there was a failure in the care field, if you want to put it in that sense. So that became all a part of the ritual that I did today. And I use the word ritual loosely, but in a sense it was sacred. And then I became to realize I want to let you go. I'm distributing the tobacco and I want to embrace the experience and thank all the beings, all the care that went into who built that sidewalk I'm just sitting on now, who made that garage, who brought the wood and from the lumber, or whatever it was. It's everybody was attending. So everything that I was walking in and being part of, in positive or negative, hurting or healing experiences, I was in always a history of care and a field. And I realize there's faults, there's failures in that field of care, and I experience the results of that. And then I also pass on the results of that to, say, people I encountered after or during that time. And I was a very rebellious teenager. And I realized on this trip, because a lot of it was where I lived as a teenager, is that I wasn't a very caring person to care about everything going on around me, and who cared for the field, who cared for that community hall that we played in our band, and who cared for all the things. It's so easy to judge all those things, and I did. I was a real critical judge even in my early teens. But what I realized is that it's a very one-sided affair, and that's very common, of course, for a lot of young people, especially angry young people, hurt young people. And I was, probably out of that camp, pretty much of that ilk. And so I actually now could go back as, near 70-year-old adult in a much more relaxed, non-distressed way to rework my relations in all those places that I visited today, and the whole of them. And it was a type of, I hate to use the word just forgiveness, because that's what I'm trying to describe to you just now was not just about forgiveness. It's actually, as my Indigenous friend Foros has taught me in the book I wrote on him and his work, really he very clear that the healing medicine work, and shamans often will facilitate this through various practices that they've learned in a non-Western medical model, etc., is that they are in the process. The medicine is about bringing wholeness. So the tobacco ritual, the ride on my bike, and taking the time and the energy to go do that, putting myself outside of my normal life, was to go and bring wholeness back to these places. And I had the sense then, and this is how I'll finish the video, is I then could carry that to see my foe, right? The enemy, if you will, that which I disrespected, that's what just disrespected me. I now can re-thread that back into the weaving of my being as I carry on my further life. And I asked the beings in each place at some point, even implicitly, not necessarily overtly, now can you be with me to assist me with the strengths and gifts of what you taught me, no matter what you did to me? Doesn't matter. And at this point in my life, I can say that I have the freedom to do that. And so that was how I kind of, in a sense, made wholeness with those places. But it's so that I can carry it into the future, because I know I need strength. I need strength of these fields of care, of all of what went on, who cut the lawn, right? Or whatever it was in those places I was. And I just didn't appreciate it, any of it. I just took, for the most part, as a teenager and as a child. And so that's what I did today. And now I feel the strength somewhat, for sure. And I thank Four Arrows. I thank the tobacco tradition that goes back ancient times. Again, you see, I just wanted that little bit of a link with history and ancestry work, trauma through intergenerational work, And then I took it into very specific places of my own childhood and teenage years today. Thanks very much for listening. If you have questions, of course, and discussion we want to have, you can link on the not link, but you can write below this video. Thanks very much for listening today.